if you remember anything about the impact that this is having on the organizations that we represent at the Enchanté Network, remember this: boom and bust.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. This week on the podcast, I'm grateful to be joined by Tyler Boyce, Executive Director of the Enchanté Network, to discuss a crucial issue for the nonprofit sector, the lack of core funding. Nonprofit organizations, like businesses and government, have basic operating costs, such as insurance, rent, and computers that they must cover in order to function. Ensuring multi-year sustainable funding contributes to the strength and health of an organization, positioning it to have the resilience to not only withstand future disruptions, but respond to the growing demand for services. Unfortunately, the vast majority of organizations receive very limited core funding, and instead have to rely on project-based funding, which doesn't cover essential expenses. This is a major problem for the sector because this lack of funding impacts organizational health, capacity, and resilience, which in turn negatively impacts the quality of services they can offer for their community, the employment conditions of nonprofit workers, and the long-term sustainability of their organizations. So we're going to explore the issue of core funding today. Tyler, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
So to kick off, the Enchanté Network is a national network connecting and supporting over 200 Pride centers and 2SLGBTQI plus service providers across Canada. Before we dive into today's topic, can you tell us about your work and how you support organizations across the country?
Yeah. So again, thanks for having me, Bruce. Essentially, the Enchanté Network has a very simple and clear mission. We want a vibrant, sustainable, indigenized, anti-racist, 2S LGBTQI plus sector from coast to coast to coast. For those listeners who don't know what the alphabet soup I'm talking about stands for, it stands for Two-Spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex communities, and others who may use different terms to refer to their sexual orientation or gender identity. At the Enchanté Network, we're really focused on being that glue within the sector. We have marriage equality, and that's wonderful, but that was very much a first step and not a last step. As I'm sure we'll get to in the podcast, there are a lot of other barriers that we're looking to overcome through the work of frontline 2SLGBTQI plus organizations. And here at the Enchanté Network, we're looking to really be that driver of this movement moving forward, and also the glue that holds us together.
Terrific. It's a great overview. So how are your member organizations doing? And are you observing any common trends amongst the nonprofits that you support?
So a lot of folks don't know this, but the first time ever in Canadian history that there was a specific envelope of money for queer and trans organizations in Canada was in 2020. So while we had the beginning of the pandemic, we also saw the first time ever queer and trans organizations were being funded to build capacity. It takes a lot longer than that 1 year of funding. And that's what the funding was for, 1 year, to build capacity in groups that have been historically marginalized and excluded from funding for so long. Slap a pandemic on top of that, and we have an impossible situation. So since that initial investment, we've seen this blossoming of Canada's queer and trans service sector. We've seen our members build connections in their own communities. Through the Enchanté Network, they've been able to build connections all throughout the country. We've seen executive directors burnt out and feeling like they're alone in this work, now with blossoming communities of people from coast to coast to coast to lean on, to provide support to, and to receive support from. While at the same time we're seeing this burgeoning of the sector, we're also seeing heightened hate crimes against the community. We're seeing things that we thought would never happen, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States, to the startling high hate crimes against trans communities in Canada, all reach this fever pitch. And at the middle of this, well, there are organizations like the Enchanté network and the 200 organizations that we support across the country that are left to pick up the pieces, provide support, and also at the same time, try to make sure that they have enough money in the bank to keep the lights on.
Wow, that's interesting to know. So let's talk specifically about core funding. I mean, the lack of predictable funding that supports the organization's operations is detrimental to our sector. I mean, in addition to being chronically underfunded, organizations most often receive funding for projects, and this funding doesn't cover operational expenses that are crucial to offering programs. Rarely do organizations receive funding specifically for these kinds of expenses, which are essential to carrying on their mission. What can you share about the impact that this lack of funding has on your own organization and the organizations in your network?
So, Bruce, when we have this conversation, and for those listening at home, if you remember anything about the impact that this is having on the organizations that we represent at the Enchanté Network, remember this: boom and bust. There are these periods where money is flowing in, the boom, but it's for a project, a big flashy project that some funder or politician gets to take credit for. And then the bust is at the end of that project, the community that was relying on these services, the organization that is relying on this project grant to be able to keep the lights on, well, there's the bust. The bust happens with communities that are now without support, and it also happens with organizations that are in this precarious cycle where you have money and the money gets cut off. It's like if you're going to go get a glass of water and you don't know if the faucet is going to have water running or nothing is going to come out constantly. That's what we're seeing with our members. We're seeing that they're in this precarious cycle of not having stability. And at the Enchanté Network, we are here to change that. Queer and trans organizations provide life-saving services. Canadians care about the lives of queer and trans folks in this country. We've always been a place that prides ourselves on tolerance. It's time to start recognizing that the people who are doing that work on the ground, they deserve to be able to do it in a way that honors the holistic lives of the people that they're serving. Our lives don't exist within a cute little 2-month or 18-month project. Our lives are expansive and we deserve support 365 days a year. So that operational funding, the part that is a little bit less glamorous, the part that pays the electricity bill, the part that pays for your staff's professional development, the part that pays for those things that really keep the work going, they deserve to be valued because they're the benchmark, the foundation of the work that we're able to do every single day.
Absolutely. So we're going to ask a couple of questions that are almost like the mirror opposites, one around opportunities and one around challenges. So we're going to start with the challenges one first. As you have conversations with your members and organizations across the country, do you see patterns or trends emerging as to how the lack of core long-term or sustainable funding is affecting organizations? Are there any commonalities that you're seeing surface from across the country?
With a lack of, that kind of funding and being available, we're seeing that there's this disconnect between the needs that people have on the ground and the things that organizations are being funded to do. So there's this disconnect between, organizations and the people walking through the organizations. And I just want to underscore that should be like an alarm bell for everybody and anybody with a little bit of sense. I know that we can create a better system than that, but that's a pattern that we're seeing. Obviously, there are organizations that are able to be very creative in the way that they offer their services. There are organizations that are able to continue meeting that need, leveraging project funding or time-based funding and operating within a scarcity model of a lack of core funding. But we shouldn't have to operate within a scarcity model. Queer and trans people deserve to have holistic services, and we can provide that to them. This country can provide a higher level of care and attention to one of our core values, which is being a tolerant place where folks are supported to be able to achieve what they want to achieve in their life.
Great summation. So now we're going to flip this because you've already started down that path. You've talked aspirationally about what can happen for organizations if they've got this kind of funding. From a tactical perspective, if the members that you've got, the organizations you connect with, had longer term sustainable funding that drove right at core operations, what are some of the on the ground opportunities or benefits that you could see for them?
So I'll give you an example. When we're talking about trans youth in a rural community in Alberta, we want to know that, well, we already know that they're accessing healthcare at a queer and trans organization because of the laws and legislation in that province. So core funding looks like that trans youth having access to gender affirming care, having access to counseling, support, service navigation, not just up until a grant ends, but always in their communities. Queer and trans folks in rural communities shouldn't feel like they have to leave their community. They shouldn't be pushed out of their communities to move to the Montreals, Torontos, and Vancouvers of the country. They should also be able to have the choice to stay in their communities, to know that they can access gender affirming care in that community. And when we talk about core funding, that's exactly what we're looking to build. We're looking to build equal opportunity to public services in every city, village, and community in Canada. And another one of the common trends that we're seeing in the queer and trans organizations that we support is that they're really having to push back against schools now for the first time. So what does comprehensive sex ed look like? What does it look like when we want schools to be talking about consent? And sometimes, yes, it's pushing back on schools to include this type of curriculum. Other times, it's queer and trans organizations that are being brought in to do this sort of work because the capacity doesn't exist within schools. And I share this to say that queer and trans organizations are playing an instrumental role in society and should be valued as such. So when we talk about core funding, well, what we're really talking about is our core values. And the core value that queer and trans organizations are bringing to Canada is one about inclusivity, equity, tolerance, and essentially children understanding, youth understanding what consent looks like. I think that brings an enormous benefit to Canadian society, one that is more than deserving of core funding.
Tyler, I'd be interested in getting your reaction to something I've heard as well. And that is, as we are operating organizations in a more challenging labor market, that long-term sustainable funding will allow us to compete for talent to make sure that we've got quality people running programs who are going to stay around for a while. Do you hear any of the conversation around the labor market issue?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can give you a great example of that. So in 2022, so just last year, so many of our member organizations, they didn't know if their funding was going to be extended after March 31st. Because we're in this boom and bust cycle of project funding and there's no core funding. So what we saw was a mass exodus of queer and trans employees or employees at queer and trans organizations leaving, not because they don't believe in the mission or because they don't care for their communities or because they don't need a job, but because precisely of the fact that they didn't know if those positions were going to exist after March 31st, because things get caught up in the bureaucracy and people get caught in the middle. So if we're able to offer stable employment through core funding, we will be able to not only attract talent, because we already do that, but we'll be able to retain the talent that we already have. So really, really, really good point to bring up, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you for your comments on that. So earlier you mentioned the LGBTQ Community Capacity Fund that was launched by the federal government. Can you tell us about this initiative, its amount, the involvement of the Enchanté network, and how it's contributed to strengthening the organizations in your network and those who are your members?
Yeah. So, like I said, this was the first time in Canadian history where a specific envelope of money was extended to queer and trans organizations specifically. Obviously, it was $15 million, but when you actually break it down for the number of folks who applied, it was extremely oversubscribed. When we look into it, only 76 organizations actually received some funding from that amount. There was more than double, according to what we've heard from our members, the amount of applicants versus the number of folks that were actually extended that amount. So already we see that it's long overdue because everyone's banging at the doors to be able to access the fund. For those that got the fund, the lucky ones that were able to get a bit of that money, it was specifically for capacity building. Now, I have to give credit where credit's due. Oftentimes, governments love projects. This was a little bit different. It was focused on building capacity. That looks like building out, what an organization looks like, a strategic plan, a financial infrastructure. It looks like investing in professional development. It looks like brainstorming about what we need to not only have something big and flashy, but to give people the skills to be able to continue and build capacity beyond the fund. Revolutionary, amazing, very, very nice to see the federal government thinking innovatively about how they fund. Organizations like the Enchanté Network was a beneficiary of that fund. We exist in large part to the national scale that we exist at right now because we were able to leverage that fund to build capacity, to really understand what it means to build the skills necessary to continue beyond the grant. And the Enchanté is living proof that the Community Capacity Fund did some really good things in Canada. On the flip side of it, I talked about those that were not able to access that funding. What about them? And going further into it, I've already talked about organizations that didn't know if their funding was going to continue. Those were recipients of the Community Capacity Fund. Folks were able to kind of go through the pandemic and really have a lot of new barriers that they were navigating. And also was the first time in Canada that this fund was rolled out. It takes a lot longer than 18 months to build organizational capacity, especially in a sector that's being funded for the first time. So where do we go from here? And that's the million-dollar question that Enchanté is trying to get folks to think about. Where do we go after a government or a foundation has invested in the early stages of capacity? Where do we go from there? Do we continue investing in capacity? And this really throws a wedge in all of the ways that we evaluate success of a grant. Are we evaluating that the Community Capacity Fund was successful because organizations were able to diversify their funding? Is it because organizations are still around? What are we measuring this on? But what we know to be true is that it takes longer than 18 months during a pandemic to build capacity with a first of its kind type funding strategy.
So I'm going to come back to the where do we go next question in a second here, but your point around having enough time to be able to take the funding, implement, demonstrate impact. It's something that we're constantly speaking with funders to say, yes, we understand that you want to show immediate effect for the dollars that you're investing, but on the ground, it does take time. And we need to be constantly reminding whether it's government, individuals, corporations, foundations, those who are investing in the entire sector to make sure that they provide enough time for the work to be done. But sort of our last question then is to just maybe think a bit broader. And it goes to your point around what comes next. What else could the federal government do to support the organizations in your network?
So right now, I think that investing in organizations, I'll be a little bit, facetious, but, the Enchanté Network plays a very key role in making sure that the little guy actually has a seat at the table. For a long time in Canada, folks didn't know that there are hundreds of 2SLGBTQI plus organizations in every single province and territory. Those are the folks who make up the Enchanté Network, this national network. So making sure that there's an entity like us to make sure that those living in Newfoundland, in Nunavut, in Yellowknife, in Alberta, as well as in Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver are represented and brought together to really think about the state of the movement and advocate for our priorities ourselves in a truly democratic way. When it comes to the funding piece, right now, the Enchanté Network has launched our campaign for a national 2SLGBTQI plus endowment fund. We've seen two endowments come out in Canada, the Equality Fund and the recently announced $200 million Black-led philanthropic fund. Right now, let me be super frank, we have a minority government and we don't know if there was a change of government, where queer and trans folks would fit into the agendas of politicians who haven't really been very forthright about their commitment to equality in Canada. So this boom and bust cycle could continue, and that lack of core funding, that lack of even project funding could disappear really quickly. An endowment fund is about investing a large sum of money. We'll use the Black-led philanthropic fund as an example. $200 million gets ethically invested, and the return on that money goes straight to communities. It's taking the power out of, or the precarity out of politics, and it's putting some stability into the nonprofit sector. And right now we have one for feminist organizations with the Equality Fund, and Black-led and Black-serving organizations with the Black-led Philanthropic Fund. And the Enchanté Network is very excited to be steering the creation of a 2SLGBTQI plus endowment fund that puts power back to the people.
Great thoughts. It's so interesting. At the heart of so much of these conversations that organizational leaders are having right now is a bit more certainty around their financial futures. And so whether it's ongoing commitments from funders of all kinds to core funding, or it's the idea of endowments that can also help ensure that there are dollars for tomorrow, these are going to allow organizations to make longer term decisions, attract and retain, to your point earlier, staff who want to work in these organizations and want to stay, but allow us to be more competitive as employers. So Tyler, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Looking forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thanks, Bruce. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.